The storm knocked out the entire grid at 2:17 a.m. By sunrise, my only heat source was stacked beside my garage, and 2 days later, it was gone. When the wind first started howling, I was already outside in boots and gloves, dragging split oak from the side yard to the concrete pad beside my garage. The temperature had dropped to 9 degrees, and the power company's outage map was glowing red across the county. I stacked the wood carefully, tight rows, 4 feet high, covered with a weighted tarp secured by bungee cords. I even shoveled a clean perimeter around it, so nothing touched the siding. By morning, the power was out across the entire subdivision. You could see it in the stillness. No porch lights, no garage doors humming open, no furnace exhaust steaming from rooftops, just snow drifting sideways and neighbors walking cautiously down driveways with flashlights. I lit the fireplace manually. You could hear the draft pull through the chimney as flames caught the first logs. Inside, the house warmed slowly, 1 degree at a time. Around noon, I stepped outside again. The wind had eased, but snow was piling against fences. I brushed ice off the tarp covering the firewood and tightened the straps. Across the street, I noticed 2 board members from the HOA standing near the clubhouse parking lot, pointing toward different homes and talking over a clipboard. One of them gestured down my side of the street, then scribbled something down. At the time, I assumed they were checking for storm damage. By day 2, the outage hadn't improved. I carried an armload of logs from the stack into the house, boots crunching on packed snow. My neighbor Mark walked over, rubbing his hands together. "The HOA's been driving around all morning," he said. "They've got that landscaping truck out." I looked toward the entrance. Sure enough, the association's contracted landscaping company, green logo on the doors, was idling near the corner. 2 workers were spreading salt along the clubhouse walkway. Still, nothing seemed unusual.
That night, as the temperature dipped again, I stepped outside with a flashlight to grab more wood. The beam swept across the garage wall. Concrete. Bare concrete. I stopped moving. The tarp was gone. The stacked rows were gone. Even the small pile of bark I'd swept aside earlier was gone. The only thing left was a faint square outline where the snow hadn't settled evenly. I walked the perimeter with the flashlight, boots scraping against the concrete pad. No scattered logs, no debris trail. Whoever removed it had taken everything cleanly. I stood there for a full minute in silence, the cold cutting through my jacket. Inside, the fireplace was still burning, but now I could see the remaining supply near the hearth was limited. The next morning, while I was boiling water on a propane camping burner in the kitchen, my phone buzzed. Cellular service was spotty, but emails were trickling through. Subject line, Storm Debris Enforcement Notice. I opened it. The HOA stated that unsecured combustible materials posing a community hazard had been removed under emergency storm authority. It cited fire risk and obstruction concerns and included a line item invoice for debris removal services. At the bottom, it warned that repeated violations could result in daily fines once normal operations resumed. I stared at the screen. The wood hadn't been scattered across the yard. It wasn't blocking a sidewalk. It was stacked on my own concrete pad beside my garage, covered and contained. I pulled on my boots again and walked outside. 2 houses down, I saw something that made my chest tighten. The landscaping truck was parked halfway along the curb, its bed partially covered by a mesh tarp. A few split logs were visible near the tailgate, same cut length as mine, same pale oak grain. One of the HOA board members, Tom, was standing near the driver's door, gesturing toward another house before turning back. I didn't approach, not yet. Instead, I walked slowly around my garage and crouched down near the concrete pad. Snow had been disturbed in long drag patterns, parallel lines leading toward the street. Boot impressions overlapped in several directions. This hadn't been wind, this had been organized. As I stood up, the landscaping truck's engine revved. The vehicle rolled forward, tires crunching over snowpack, and disappeared around the corner. Inside the house, I opened my laptop. Thankfully, the backup battery system for my security cameras was still active. The exterior cameras around my driveway and garage automatically upload footage to cloud storage with time-stamped metadata, even during outages. I clicked into the timeline. There was motion detection logged at 10:42 a.m. the previous day. I hovered over the clip. Outside, the wind rattled the loose shutter against the siding. Inside, the fire crackled low. If the footage showed what I suspected, this wasn't storm cleanup. It was something else entirely. And if they thought I'd just pay the invoice and restock quietly, they hadn't realized what my cameras might have recorded. What exactly did 10:42 a.m. reveal?
At 10:42 a.m., the wind was still gusting hard enough to shake the camera housing. The footage opened with blowing snow crossing the frame in streaks. My firewood stack sat exactly as I'd left it, tight rows, tarp secured, straps visible. The timestamp in the upper corner was precise down to the second. Then, a white pickup with the HOA landscaping logo turned slowly into view. It didn't stop in the street, it backed directly into my driveway. I paused the video and zoomed in. The logo on the door matched the vendor listed in the HOA's annual budget packet. The truck bed was empty when it arrived. I hit play. 2 landscaping workers stepped out first, boots crunching over snow. They walked straight to the stack and began unhooking the tarp straps. No knocking, no attempt to contact me. 30 seconds later, Tom, still wearing that navy HOA windbreaker, walked into frame. He wasn't observing from a distance. He stood beside the workers and pointed at the base of the stack, directing how to lift it. I watched one worker brace his foot against my garage wall for leverage while sliding logs free. Another climbed into the truck bed. The men formed a quick rhythm: lift, toss, stack, repeat. The soundless footage showed efficiency. This wasn't chaotic cleanup. It was organized removal. I scrubbed forward. At 10:55 a.m., the stack was half gone. At 11:03 a.m., it was completely gone. They didn't leave debris. They didn't scatter it. They swept loose bark into a shovel and loaded that, too. Before leaving, one worker kicked snow over the bare concrete to cover the outline. The truck bed was now completely full. I leaned back in my chair. Outside my window, smoke from my fireplace curled weakly into the gray sky. Inside, the house temperature had already dropped 3 degrees since morning. This wasn't about hazards. This was deliberate. I opened the HOA email again and reread the phrasing: removed unsecured combustible materials posing community risk under emergency authority. But the video told a different story. The wood had been secured. It was on my property, and they hadn't even attempted notice before removal. Before reacting, I checked something else. My driveway camera captures license plates as vehicles exit. I pulled that clip up. Clear as day, the landscaping truck's license plate number, time-stamped 11:06 a.m., leaving my driveway with a fully loaded bed. The metadata panel showed motion start and end times, GPS stamp, and cloud upload confirmation. Documented. I stepped outside again with my phone in hand. The landscaping truck was parked near the clubhouse, tailgate down. I walked casually down the sidewalk, pretending to check snow buildup along my curb. From the angle of the street, I could see into the truck bed. The logs were still there. Distinct split patterns. One piece even had a knot I recognized. I'd split that log myself last fall. 2 workers were now unloading the wood behind the clubhouse maintenance shed, stacking it loosely along the rear fence. I didn't speak to them. I simply recorded a short video from the public sidewalk showing the HOA truck, the logo, and the unloading process. Snow fell steadily around them. One of the workers noticed me and hesitated mid-lift. I lowered my phone and kept walking.
Back home, I reviewed everything again. The arrival time, the removal, the plate capture, the unloading at the clubhouse. Then I checked the HOA website. Under emergency procedures, it referenced temporary mitigation of immediate threats to common areas. Common areas, not private concrete pads attached to deeded garages. Still, I knew how this could play out. The board would claim discretionary authority during storm conditions. They'd argue visual uniformity, fire risk, or obstruction, and for a moment they might even convince the neighborhood that it was justified. But the footage wasn't interpretive. It was physical. It showed direction. It showed supervision. It showed property being relocated to association-controlled space. Before making any move, I downloaded every clip in its original format, preserving metadata intact. I backed them up to 2 separate drives. Then I checked the vendor agreement stored in last year's HOA financial disclosures. There it was. Scope of work. The landscaping company was authorized for snow removal, salting, and maintenance of common property grounds. Nothing about entering private driveways. Nothing about removing homeowner materials. I printed that page. The house was colder now. I fed the last 2 logs into the fireplace and watched the flames flare briefly before settling into a low burn. The power company estimated restoration in another 36 hours. Without firewood, I'd have to rely on space heaters once electricity returned. But for now, heat meant wood, and my wood was stacked behind the clubhouse. They thought this would be paperwork and compliance. They didn't know I had footage of the entire operation. If you want to see how this escalates and how documented evidence changes everything, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next involves the board doubling down in a way they probably didn't expect to be recorded. The question wasn't whether they took it. The question was what they'd claim when confronted with proof.
By late afternoon, the power flickered back on. You could hear it ripple through the neighborhood. Garage doors humming to life, thermostats clicking, porch lights blinking in unison. I stood by the window watching heaters restart in nearby homes. Across the street, Tom was outside again, brushing snow off his SUV. Timing mattered now. I grabbed my coat, printed copies of 3 still images from the footage: truck in driveway, workers loading, Tom standing beside them, and walked to the clubhouse. The maintenance shed behind it was still partially open. Through the gap, I could see the stack. My stack, not neatly arranged like it had been beside my garage. It was piled loosely along the rear fence, partially covered by a blue tarp weighted with bricks. Snow clung to the top layer. I stepped closer, staying on the sidewalk, and zoomed my phone camera in. There was no question. Same split pattern, same knot piece, same mix of oak lengths. Tom noticed me from across the parking lot and started walking over. "You can't be back there," he said evenly, stopping about 10 feet away. "I'm not," I replied, gesturing to the sidewalk beneath my boots, "just observing." He glanced toward the shed. That wood was creating a fire hazard. Storm protocol allows us to remove combustibles. I held up one of the printed stills. "This is 10:42 a.m. yesterday, your vendor truck backing into my driveway." He didn't take the paper. "You'll need to take that up in writing. The board approved the action." There it was, the first escalation. They weren't denying it. They were justifying it. I lowered the paper and nodded. Understood. Back home, I drafted a short email, not emotional, not accusatory, just factual. Attached were the 3 still images, the license plate capture, and a timestamp summary. I included a single question. Under which specific bylaw section does the association claim authority to enter a homeowner's driveway and remove secured personal property? I sent it to the full board distribution list. Within an hour, a reply came from the HOA secretary. Subject line: Emergency Authority Clarification. The message stated that during declared severe weather events, the board reserves discretion to mitigate hazards deemed visually or materially unsafe. visually unsafe. That phrasing wasn't in the bylaws. I pulled up the governing documents again and searched the term. Nothing. I went back to the vendor contract and reread the indemnification section. The landscaping company operated under direction of the HOA, but only within defined service areas. Private driveways weren't listed. That night, a new community-wide email went out. It stated that additional unsecured materials may be subject to removal as storm mitigation continues. That was escalation number 2. They weren't backing down. They were broadening the claim. The next morning, I woke to a new notice posted on the HOA website, a temporary amendment to storm procedures, retroactively dated 2 days prior. I stared at the timestamp. It had been uploaded at 8:12 a.m., well after my wood had already been removed. They were trying to formalize authority after the fact. I opened my camera dashboard again. Every clip showed clear timestamps embedded in the footage. The removal happened the day before any amendment appeared online. Metadata doesn't care about revisions.
That afternoon, I drove to the county records office, not for a complaint, but for clarity. I requested confirmation of property boundaries and whether an HOA board has automatic emergency entry rights onto private driveways absent express covenant language. The clerk handed me a printed copy of the subdivision plat and a brief statutory summary regarding trespass and contractual authority. The driveway was deeded, exclusive use. Emergency municipal access is one thing. HOA access requires covenant support. Back home, I noticed something else. The wood behind the clubhouse had changed. Half of it was gone. I parked along the curb and watched from inside my car. The landscaping truck was there again. 2 workers were loading logs from the shed area back into the truck bed. But this time, they weren't stacking it neatly. They were driving toward the front entrance sign and unloading it beside the decorative stone wall. I stepped out. They were arranging my firewood as a community warming pile near the clubhouse patio fire pit. Tom stood nearby speaking to a small group of neighbors, gesturing toward the pile as if it had always belonged there. "This is for shared use during outages," he was saying. That was escalation number 3. They weren't just refusing the removal, they were repurposing it publicly. I recorded again, from the sidewalk. The logo, the workers unloading, Tom presenting it. He glanced at me but didn't approach this time. Back home, I organized everything chronologically. Arrival clip, removal clip, license plate capture, unloading behind shed, relocation to clubhouse patio, website amendment upload time. Visual evidence, no speculation, just sequence. For a moment, I understood their strategy. If the wood became community property fast enough, the narrative might stick. Storm generosity, hazard mitigation, shared resource. But metadata freezes time in ways revisions cannot. The question now wasn't whether they'd admit overreach. It was whether they realized how thoroughly documented every step had been. And if they tried to push this further, what would happen when those timestamps were placed side by side with their retroactive amendment? By that evening, the community warming pile was lit. I watched from across the street as flames climbed through logs I had split myself. Neighbors stood around the clubhouse patio, hands extended toward the fire pit. Some of them believed the story they'd been told, that the board had gathered scattered debris to help everyone stay warm. But nothing about this was debris. 2 kids poked at the fire with long branches. One log cracked sharply as it shifted, sending sparks upward. I zoomed my phone camera in and captured the detail of the grain pattern. Same knot, same cut angle. It was unmistakable. Tom stood near the patio door explaining something to a small group. He gestured toward the stack as if it were a coordinated effort. The landscaping truck was parked nearby, tailgate open, a few remaining pieces still visible inside. I didn't interrupt. Instead, I walked the perimeter of the clubhouse property, filming continuously. I recorded the truck's logo, the workers arranging leftover pieces beside the stone wall, and the temporary sign someone had taped to a patio chair. Storm Firewood, community use. That sign hadn't existed 2 days ago. Back home, I transferred every clip into a single folder labeled with exact timestamps. Then I placed the HOA's new website amendment next to the removal footage in a side-by-side comparison. Removal, 10:42 a.m. day 2. Amendment posted, 8:12 a.m. day 3. They had formalized authority after executing the action. The next morning, I received another email. This time, it wasn't just a clarification, it was an invoice reminder. It stated that debris removal fees would remain applied unless payment was received within 7 days. For a moment, it looked like they were doubling down. They were betting most homeowners wouldn't challenge a storm decision. I stepped outside again. Snow had begun melting along the driveway edges. The concrete pad where my stack had been was now fully exposed. You could see faint drag lines still etched in the surface from where logs had been pulled away. I crouched down and photographed the marks from multiple angles, placing a tape measure beside them for scale. Physical evidence. Then I drove to the clubhouse during daylight hours. The fire pit was cold now, ashes scattered across the stone base. I walked past casually and counted what remained of the pile. Roughly half my wood had already been burned. 2 board members were standing near the entrance discussing something on a tablet. I overheard fragments: insurance optics, liability reduction, uniform enforcement. Uniform enforcement. I knew something else they hadn't considered.
Across the neighborhood, several homes still had decorative wood racks beside garages, metal frames holding split logs neatly stacked for aesthetics. Those hadn't been touched. Selective enforcement is measurable. I spent the afternoon walking the subdivision, recording each visible wood rack from the sidewalk. I counted 9 properties with firewood stored openly. Some stacks were larger than mine had been. None of them had received removal. By evening, I had a compiled folder showing my secured stack being removed, wood relocated to HOA property, retroactive amendment timing, community use signage, and other homeowners' untouched wood racks. No speculation, just comparative visuals. That night, the board posted another update online, praising the Community Firewood initiative as an example of proactive leadership during crisis conditions. They thought the narrative had shifted, but narratives don't override timestamps. The following morning, I requested a copy of the HOA's insurance advisory related to storm mitigation. If removal was truly liability-driven, there would be documentation instructing such action. The response came quickly. There was no insurer directive attached, only internal board discussion notes, which meant the public claim of insurance requirement was unsupported. At this point, everything was documented visually: the taking, the relocation, the use, the justification shift. The trap wasn't confrontation, it was sequence. Because when you align original timestamps, physical relocation footage, and policy amendments side by side, the order tells its own story. And if you want to see how aligning evidence changes the entire balance of power in this situation, make sure you're subscribed. The next step isn't emotional, it's procedural, and it forces accountability without a single raised voice. The board believed storm urgency gave them cover, but what happens when that cover disappears under documented chronology?
The special board meeting was scheduled for Thursday night. It wasn't originally on the calendar. The notice went up mid-week, labeled as a storm response review session. No agenda details beyond that. When I arrived, the clubhouse lights were fully on, folding chairs arranged in rows facing the long board table. A portable space heater hummed near the back wall. Outside, the remnants of my firewood sat reduced to a modest pile beside the cold fire pit. Neighbors filled most of the seats. Some were curious. Others looked mildly irritated about lingering outages and snow delays. The board members sat at the front with laptops open, papers stacked neatly beside them. Tom cleared his throat and began summarizing the storm response efforts: salting, snow plowing, debris mitigation. Then he used the phrase again, hazard removal initiative. When public comment opened, I stood. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't accuse, I simply walked to the front with a small portable monitor and a USB drive. "I'd like to provide a timeline for clarity," I said. I connected the monitor to the clubhouse TV input. The first image appeared, the landscaping truck reversing into my driveway, timestamp visible in the corner. Murmurs spread across the room. I advanced to the next clip, workers removing the tarp, Tom stepping into frame, clear direction gestures. No sound was needed. The third clip showed the truck leaving, bed fully loaded. Then I displayed the website screenshot showing the emergency amendment upload time, side by side. Removal at 10:42 a.m. Policy posted the following morning. The room grew quiet. Tom leaned toward his microphone. "This was done under discretionary authority. I understand the claim. I'm only presenting sequence." Next, I showed footage of the wood being unloaded behind the clubhouse shed, then relocated to the patio and labeled for community use. Finally, I projected a grid of still photos, 9 homes with visible wood racks still intact. "No removal occurred at these addresses," I said, all photographed within the same time frame. A board member shifted in her seat. "That's selective enforcement," someone in the audience said quietly. Tom adjusted his posture. "Emergency decisions don't always allow for uniformity." I nodded. "Understood," which is why I requested the insurer's written directive. There wasn't one. I placed a printed copy of the vendor contract clause on the front table. Vendor scope limits service to common property grounds. The landscaping company supervisor, who had been seated along the wall, avoided eye contact. For a moment, it looked like the board might attempt to outvote the issue, to lean on discretionary language and move forward. But visuals change rooms.
One neighbor raised her hand. If they can enter one driveway without notice, what stops them from entering others? Another added, why was policy updated after the removal? The discussion shifted. This wasn't about firewood anymore. It was about authority boundaries. Tom requested a brief recess. Board members stepped into a side office. Through the glass panel, I could see animated conversation, hands gesturing, papers moving, one member scrolling rapidly through a laptop. 10 minutes later, they returned. Tom spoke first. After reviewing the presented materials, the board acknowledges that procedural timing may not have aligned with documentation updates. Carefully worded. He continued, the association will credit the assessed debris removal fee and reimburse documented replacement cost for the wood. A neighbor asked, and the amendment? Another board member responded, the temporary storm procedure will be withdrawn pending legal review. That was the moment they seemed to win earlier in the week. Public justification, community fire narrative. But now the sequence had shifted, not because of confrontation, because of chronology. Tom added one more line. Future storm mitigation actions will require homeowner notice unless immediate life safety risk is verified. Verified. Documented. They voted unanimously to rescind the citation. No shouting, no threats, just recorded facts aligning with contract language and timestamps. After the meeting, neighbors approached quietly. One asked how I captured the metadata. Another said she'd be reviewing her own exterior camera settings. Outside, I walked past the reduced woodpile one last time. The remaining pieces would likely be removed in the morning. The landscaping truck was already gone. By the weekend, the clubhouse patio was clear. No sign, no shared stack, just stone and snowmelt. The official meeting minutes posted 3 days later reflected a clarification of emergency procedure authority. No admission of wrongdoing, but the reimbursement check arrived the following week. And the revised storm policy, this time dated accurately, limited vendor access strictly to common property without homeowner consent. What began as a missing stack of firewood ended as a documented boundary reset. The board never admitted fault directly. They didn't need to. The footage had already spoken. And in HOA disputes, sometimes the strongest argument isn't louder, it's earlier. time-stamped, and impossible to rearrange. The reimbursement check arrived in a plain white envelope. No handwritten note, no apology letter, just a printed voucher covering the documented market value of seasoned oak, calculated down to the half cord. I didn't cash it immediately. Instead, I drove to a local supplier and filmed the process of purchasing replacement wood. Fresh stacks were loaded into the back of my truck, neatly strapped and measured. The receipt showed date, quantity, and cost, clear and itemized. When I pulled back into the neighborhood, a few neighbors noticed. This time, I didn't stack the wood loosely beside the garage. I installed a metal firewood rack anchored into the concrete pad. I positioned it 2 feet from the siding, covered it with a fitted weather tarp, and mounted a small laminated placard on the rack itself. Private property, secured storage. Then I adjusted my driveway camera angle slightly, widening the field of view to capture the entire rack and the street approach in one frame. 2 visible lenses, clear placement, no ambiguity. Over the next week, something subtle changed in the neighborhood. The revised storm policy was posted publicly, this time clearly dated and approved after legal consultation. It included a new clause. Vendor operations are restricted to common elements unless homeowner consent is documented in writing or immediate life safety hazards are confirmed by municipal authority. Municipal authority, not board discretion. A few days later, I saw the landscaping supervisor outside the clubhouse reviewing a new laminated operations sheet with one of the board members. He pointed at highlighted sections while nodding. Operational correction. One evening, Tom approached me while I was bringing groceries in. "I want to clarify something," he said carefully. "The intention was never personal." "I understand. That's why sequence matters." He nodded once and walked back toward his driveway. There were no further emails, no additional notices. The community fire pit remained empty through the rest of winter. Neighbors who had watched the meeting began asking broader questions at future sessions about budget approvals, vendor oversight, and documentation standards. The tone shifted from assumption to verification. That's the thing about documented evidence. It doesn't escalate conflict, it stabilizes it. Because once a timeline is established, arrival, removal, relocation, amendment, the facts don't bend. Weeks later, the board published updated vendor guidelines on the HOA website. They required contractors to photograph work areas before and after service. They required board authorization logs for emergency actions. In other words, they implemented their own version of what had held them accountable: visual documentation.
One snowy afternoon toward the end of the season, I stepped outside and brushed fresh powder off my new firewood rack. The camera above the garage blinked quietly in standby mode. Across the street, a neighbor was stacking his own wood more carefully than before, measuring the distance from his wall, securing a fitted cover. Not because of fear, because of clarity. The storm that started all this had passed weeks ago. Power was stable, roads were clear. But the real shift wasn't about electricity, it was about limits. The HOA had momentarily believed emergency language could substitute for covenant authority. They leaned on narrative, hazard mitigation, shared resource, proactive leadership. For a moment, it seemed like they had won the room. But documentation works differently. It doesn't argue, it aligns. Arrival time, vendor scope, policy upload timestamp, selective enforcement visuals. Each piece alone was explainable. Together, they formed a sequence that couldn't be rearranged. That was the trap. Not confrontation, not retaliation, chronology. By the time winter ended, no one referenced the Storm Firewood initiative anymore. It simply disappeared from conversation, replaced with updated procedures and a clearer understanding of boundaries. And my new stack remained untouched, because once actions are recorded, labeled, and compared against authority, decisions become more careful. If you've ever dealt with an HOA overreach situation, you already know. The difference between frustration and resolution is often proof. If you want more real HOA fallout stories where documentation changes everything, make sure you're subscribed. The next one might involve a different object, but the same principle. When authority meets evidence, sequence decides the outcome. The storm knocked out power, but it also revealed something else. Not all enforcement survives a timestamp.